Number 1. Corn Maze. Have you ever been to one of those corn mazes in the fall? My county does them in October, in lieu of haunted houses. I've always sort of liked them, but think that I'd like the haunted houses much better. I mean, it sort of makes sense why a ghost would haunt a house, and I could never figure out why a ghost would haunt a corn maze. Unless they were killed in the cornfield, but I digress. I stopped going to them when I was a teenager. However, one October, when I was hanging out with my friends at night, and drinking a little, we started talking about the local corn maze. I claimed that I had never found them scary, and didn't understand why anyone did. Well, my buddy Todd then dared me to go through the corn maze at night, if I wasn't scared at all. I told him the corn maze was closed, and he laughed. He asserted that it would not be very difficult to break into the maze, and I knew he was right. So I had to put my money where my mouth was and take the dare. We got into Todd's pickup truck. There were 4 of us, and we drove out to the corn maze. It was about midnight when we got there. I guess this is an obvious statement, but it was so different seeing the maze in the nighttime than the daytime. It actually looked much creepier. It didn't have any of the people dressed up as monsters either, but that just made it even creepier. It looked abandoned and dark. So Todd told me that the dare was that I had to walk the entire maze. He would drive his truck to the other side of the maze, where the exit was. He and my friends had to promise me that they weren't going to sneak into the maze and try to scare me. I wasn't really sure how likely they were to keep that promise, though. I slowly made my way into the maze. It's important to know that the walls of the maze were large enough that I could not see over them. It didn't take very long before I began hearing noises in the maze. I knew that it had to be Todd. He broke his rule and was following me. At first, it was just footsteps. But after a while, someone began moving the corn stalks on the other side of the wall. Several times I called out, told Todd to knock it off. I tried to let him know that I wasn't scared, and nothing he was going to do would scare me. I wasn't completely serious, and I have to admit it was bravado. Walking through the maze with the added noises was indeed very, very freaky, but I did my best not to let it show. I was also determined to make it through the entire maze without going back and confronting him. It was then that I heard Todd taunt me aloud. He talked in an almost amusingly high voice. I can still remember the things he said, and they were comical as well as scary.
"I'm opening my knife,"
Todd said in a sing-song manner. I ignored him.
"I'm cutting off a cornstalk,"
Todd said next. I ignored him.
"I'm throwing the cornstalk at you to let you know I really have a knife,"
Todd told me. I ignored him, but was hit in the head by the cornstalk.
"Now,"
"I'm going to cut your face off," Todd told me. I tried to ignore him, but there was just something about his voice that last time. It unnerved me, and all of the bravado flooded from my system. I didn't know how much longer the maze was, but I did know that Todd was behind me, so I just took off and ran through the maze. I could tell that Todd was running after me too, so I just ran as quickly as I could, cutting each corner as closely as possible as I made my way through the maze. Todd could have his taunts once I got out and was no longer freaked out by the maze. I saw the exit, and I ran out of the maze, and then my stomach almost fell out of my body. Todd and my two other friends were standing right in front of his pickup truck, which meant he couldn't be the guy who had been following me in the maze. I ran up to them and told them to get in the truck. Todd thought I was just trying to scare him, but he suddenly turned and ran. We got into the truck and he started it and took off. When I got my breath, I told Todd that someone had been following me through the maze with a knife. Todd responded, and I'll also never forget what he said. I know. He was coming out of the maze when you told us to run. Number 2. Pacing. I had a really freaky encounter when I was in high school. Although this happened many years ago, I remember it as if it had just occurred. It wasn't the first day of fall, but it was definitely the first day that felt like fall. I was in school on a Monday. I lived in town, so I walked to and from school. Upon first stepping outside, I noticed two things. The leaves had started falling from the trees, and that there was a cold breeze in the air. The sky was overcast as well. I went back inside and got my jacket, knowing that I would need it today. It was such an odd day. I never really felt like I really woke up. I guess that is the only way I can describe how I felt. I was just off. I couldn't really pay attention in class, and spent almost all of class looking out the window, watching the leaves fall. I felt like it was going to rain, too. The clouds in the sky were very dark, and the wind picked up during the day. It was during my 5th class that I noticed someone. It wasn't unusual to see people walking along the sidewalk in front of the school. What was unusual, however, was to see someone pacing back and forth in front of the school. If pacing was even the correct word. This was a man, tall and slender. He was dressed like he was a hiker. He had on hiking boots and a backpack, and just kept walking back and forth. He'd walk from one end of the sidewalk of the block my school was on, turn around, and walk completely back to the other side. He had repeated this over and over several times before I was done with this class. I found it odd and even a bit creepy. It put images of him as a possible sexual predator into my head. But I assumed if this was really the case, he wouldn't be making it so obvious. I didn't think about him much as I went to lunch. However, my first class after lunch was also in the front of the school. Sure enough, when I went to my class, the pacer was still there, walking back and forth on the block, looking at the school. I was surprised, as I really had put him out of my mind. I would have thought that anyone, also, that had been pacing in front of a public school for hours would have been stopped by a passing police car. If he had, though, they must have decided that there was nothing wrong with the guy. I was still disconnected from the day, though. But this time, I was less daydreaming and more wondering what this guy was up to, if he indeed was up to anything. I couldn't get it out of my head. For the entire time that I was in that class, I don't think I heard a single word that the teacher said. And when it ended, I couldn't get the pacer out of my head as I went to my next class. After school, I had play practice. I stayed later than most of the other students to help another actor practice his lines. By the time I was ready to leave the school, the sun had already begun to set, and the school looked deserted. There was a light mist in the air as well, although it had not yet rained. I left out the side door of the school and walked on the sidewalk that led back behind the school. I had to go that way in order to get home. It was damp out, and the leaves were blowing harder in the wind. I knew I'd feel a lot better when I got home. And then I saw, up ahead of me, what looked like the guy from earlier, the pacer, and he was walking on the sidewalk in my direction. I felt a little uneasy at first, but realized this guy didn't know me or anything. He also didn't acknowledge me and didn't look at me as I walked. But for some reason, he still made me feel very uncomfortable. I can't explain why I felt so uncomfortable, but regardless I did. So I decided to avoid the guy. It was slightly out of my way, but I turned on a street that led into the neighborhood beside the school. I'd just walk around the block and get back to the street I was on. I don't know why, but I still felt uncomfortable. I felt like I was being watched or followed. It was irrational, but I felt it. So I turned around to look behind me. I was surprised to see that the pacer had turned on the street that I was on and was now following me. I chalked it up to a coincidence. He just happened to turn on the same street as me. When I got to the end of the block, I turned right. When I got halfway up the street, I once again felt a need to look over my shoulder. Sure enough, he had turned and was still following me. Again, this could have been a coincidence. However, when I made a third turn and headed back to the street the school was on, if he turned again, that would show that he was following me. The street came up, and I turned. Halfway down the block, I looked over my shoulder. Yes, he was following me. I decided to run back to the school. As soon as I began to run, however, I slipped forward on a wet leaf and fell on my face onto the sidewalk. I got knocked silly. Suddenly, I felt someone grab me from behind and try to lift me up. I immediately knew that it was the pacing guy. I tried to pull away, but he kept a solid grip on my arm. Also, I was still basically on my hands and knees anyway. It was then that the guy started telling me, "I need a new arm. I need a new arm." I didn't know what he meant, and he was hurting me. However, I wasn't a weakling, and once I got my bearings, I was able to flip over and kick him away from me with my feet. He didn't fall over, but he did stop trying to pick me up. He then grabbed his backpack and held it in front of him. Opening it, I smelled the most revolting stench I'd ever smelled in my entire life, and he reached into it. However, before he pulled anything out, the porch light of the house we were in front of came on. A man came out of the house with an aluminum baseball bat in his hand, and he threatened the man to get away from me. It took a few moments, but he eventually put his backpack on, turned, and left. Once he was gone, the man from the house came out and helped me up. He even gave me a ride home. I never saw the pacer again, and I always wondered what he meant about needing a new arm, and what he had been reaching for in that backpack. Number 3. A walk. I guess when I was growing up, I was a bit of an unusual kid. I didn't really like people too much, so I spent a lot of time by myself. And my parents didn't like me hanging out around the house by myself all the time, so they would always encourage me to get out of the house and do things. They pestered me enough that I eventually did it. But the only thing they really accomplished was getting me to take walks by myself. After a while, I appreciated it, because I honestly began to enjoy my lonely walks. I would walk sometimes for hours and just use the time to think about whatever was on my mind those days. I'd have to say that my favorite walks were in the fall. I could watch leaves falling from the trees forever. I loved the sound of the dry and already fallen leaves crackling under my feet as I walked on. I liked having it cool enough that I had to wear a jacket, but not cold enough that I had to wear a coat. Mostly, though, I liked it because there were not as many people out as compared to summertime. Before I go on, I should explain to you a cognitive distortion that I suffer from. It's called mind reading. If you are unfamiliar with cognitive distortions, they are mistakes in thinking that lead to faulty assumptions. Mind reading is when you assume that you know what other people are thinking. For example, if you walk by a crowd of people and you hear them laughing, and you make the assumption that they are laughing about you, that's mind reading. More often than not, it's incorrect as well. When I was 13 years old, I was out for a walk in the fall. I had been walking around for a very long time that day. Normally, I try to get back home before it gets dark, but I got way too lost in my thoughts this day, and before I knew it, the sun was going down. So I had to head home, and I was on the other side of town. Walking down Central Street, which was the main road in town, I saw someone walking in my direction, up in the distance. He was a big guy, wearing some pretty raggy clothes. As usual, my mind went somewhere that it really didn't need to go. I automatically thought the worst I could of this person. I wanted to cross the street, actually. This was a normal response for me if I saw anyone walking in my direction, and I did my best to resist it. But the closer we got to each other, the more uncomfortable I felt. I knew that I had to take what was in my mind and do my best to shoo it away, because I knew there was no danger. But as we got closer and closer, my mind just started playing tricks on me. When we were no more than a block away from each other, I guess my anxiety about it got the better of me. I quickly turned and ducked down a side street, intending to cut through it to get all the way home. I felt bad for failing, but I felt better that I was alone again. The street that I had ducked down was very dark. I lived in a pretty small town, so once you got off Central Street, you pretty much have very little light left. But like I mentioned, I felt better being by myself. I began thinking that I was, of course, jumping to conclusions. I actually felt a little bit bad about judging someone I really didn't know. Even with the cognitive distortion, I should have been able to walk past the guy. I was in thought about the incident when I suddenly felt someone touch me on the shoulder. It wasn't an aggressive touch, but it did make me jump. Before I could turn around, I heard a voice tell me, "I'd love to bite all your fingers off." I quit turning around and just took off down the street. Whoever had whispered in my ear made no effort to hold me. I never looked back. I just ran, and I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street that my house was on. Nervously turning around, I didn't see anyone. I never got a look at whomever it was that whispered that to me. I can only assume it was the guy I had seen on Central Street. Perhaps mind reading can sometimes be useful. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you haven't already, feel free to check out the Killer Orange Cat subreddit, and take a look at the merchandise store my sister set up for this channel. The links to both are included in the description to the channel. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please consider hitting the subscribe button below, or using the icon of Ichigo that will appear at the end of this closing. Feel free to leave some comments to let me know what you thought of the video, and consider sharing it with someone you think might enjoy it. You can always follow Ichigo and myself on Facebook and Twitter. If you have a story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please send it to the address included in the description. My only requirement is that the story is original, meaning that it has not been read on any other YouTube channel. And whatever you do, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.